r/is Reddit. Redditors who have worked around death/burial, what's your best ghost story? Honestly, the only creepy thing that happened when I worked in the morgue is that one of the staff killed himself in there, and I just can't imagine wanting to die in this cold, gray place surrounded by corpses. Corpses move when you cremate them. People who don't know this get spooked a lot. During my apprenticeship, I worked at a funeral home said to be haunted by an old funeral director assistant who had a heart attack in the building and died. All he ever did was mess with the chapel lights, and if you called him out, something like "John, the family is coming, please don't," they would return to normal. Not really sure if I believe it was really haunted, but saying something always fixed the issue, so I kept doing it my entire time there. I used to be a driver for a funeral home corporation. Like, drive the hearse and pick up the bodies. Never had anything creepy happen, a few funny things, a few traumatic things. In general it was a chill job. However, I did get incredibly uncomfortable one night picking up a man who died at home. He still had the defibrillator leads on his chest and his eyes were closed, which is unusual because the eyes are always open. He just looked like he was asleep or unconscious. Not rigid or pale or anything. I just had this sinking feeling for about half an hour in traffic that he was going to suddenly gasp and wake up in the body bag. Then it hit me. That would be the coolest thing ever. I'd take him home and he'd be back with his family. So I just kind of drove slowly and turned up some music and sang along and talked to him. When I got him to the funeral home, I left him out of the cooler for about an hour while I did paperwork and played on my phone. When I got another call, I checked on him and his limbs had started to stiffen. I was kind of bummed. I put him in the cooler and went on my next call. I used to work on an oncology ward as a nurse. Our side rooms were kept for end-of-life patients on palliative care, and one patient that we had been nursing for a good few weeks died early one morning. Last offices had already been done by the night staff and the patient moved to the hospital morgue, so all that remained was to clear the room of personal belongings and tidy up. I sent a student nurse that I was mentoring at the time to do this whilst I got on with the drug round. The student had known the patient fairly well and was comfortable with this job. About 10 minutes after, a colleague came to me and told me that my student had come flying out of the side room white as a sheet and was sobbing in the staff room. I went to find out what the problem was, and the student told me she had been clearing out sink area in the bathroom, had glanced up and seen the deceased patient reflected in the mirror looking at her over her shoulder. My student was a sensible girl, not given to hysterics, but for the remainder of her placement on that ward she would not go near that side room. Not a ghost story, but when I was in the army, I served on a few honor guard duties for transporting soldiers' remains. One time we were taking Korean War era remains that had been uncovered in Korea and transported to the USA for identification. For most of the remains, the transfer cases, industrial aluminum caskets, were very light, like you'd expect with 40-year-old remains. A couple of the cases were heavy, like a couple hundred pounds. I've never stopped wondering what was in those cases. It wasn't 40-year-old bones. Not me, but a colleague found a dead person in a dark smoke-filled burned-out building during the mop-up of firefighting operations. As unfortunately happens sometimes, you find them by stepping on them. If they're still intact, you kind of bounce off them. If they're fried, you can often crunch them up pretty bad under your heavy boot. Well, this guy stood right on a badly burned corpse's sternum. Crunch, right into the chest cavity. When he tried to pull his foot out, it got stuck on the ribs and the body came up at him. Burned up arms flailing about. Took him a few tried with what looked like a zombie stuck on his leg. He needed quite a bit of counseling, poor dude. My grandfather died a while back. One day me and a bunch of my cousins were playing in the front yard, rural area, since on weekends all the family likes to hang out together. So we're out having fun and see Lolo, grandfather, walking towards the house. We all greet him and he smiles at us. He walks up the porch into the house and hangs his hat by the door. We continue playing until we hear crying from the inside of the house and my uncle driving fast up the driveway. We all rush in to see what's going on and see everybody bunched up in the kitchen crying, telling us that Lolo died early that morning and they just found out. He lives a few towns away. We looked at each other and told the grown-ups, nah, we just saw him come into the house. They didn't believe us and we told them that he really did not that long ago, and he even hung up his hat by the door. So everybody rushes to the door and his hat was hanging right where we said it was. He doesn't ever go anywhere without that hat. So me and my cousins are running all over the house calling for him while our parents are so quiet and freaking out. He actually did die earlier that morning, and my grandmother couldn't find his hat anywhere in their house. We left the hat where it was and nobody ever touched it. I'm a palliative care RN who didn't believe in this stuff until I became a nurse. I have 3 to share at the moment. 1. Before my time in palliative care, I worked on a medicine unit at the hospital. One night I was returning from my second break around 3 a.m. or so and saw a man standing in the door of my patient's room. He was white, late 40s to mid 50s, dark hair which was graying, relatively fit, wearing a hospital gown. He was standing at the door with his arms crossed, and as I walked closer he turned and went inside the room. I followed because I knew it wasn't his room. Our unit was big, 36 beds, so it was entirely possibly he was a patient I had not met yet. Anyway, you can guess the rest. Went inside the room and he was nowhere to be found. I looked under the beds, ridiculous BC, someone couldn't hide there, in the lockers, washroom, behind the curtains. He was nowhere to be found. Later that night my co-worker had said she felt like someone was touching her feet when she tried to nap on her break. The break room was right next door to my patient's room, and she was in there at the time that I saw this patient. 2. Not a specific ghost story, but I just want to say 2 things about working in palliative care. 1. Patients often introduce me to deceased relatives around them or talk about people waiting or being in the room with them. 2. A lot of people know they are going to die, and I believe much is seen/heard that folks don't talk about during this time. I believe this because in our younger patients who aren't ready to go, there is often a high degree of anxiety, and many times I have been asked by a younger patient to help me, I'm going to die today or similar. 3. Once upon a time I was doing home hospice and a younger guy in his 50s was dying of occupation-related lung cancer. Anyway, I knew it was coming and asked his family if they wanted to invite anybody to say goodbye, so patient's 90-year-old father, brother, extended family, and friends came over at about 1 a.m. and I left them and sat in the kitchen to give them privacy. As I'm in there I hear this massive burst of wind chimes, which was kind of supernatural, as in did not stop, just a massive burst that went on and on instead of trickling here and there with the wind. A moment later his daughter came in to tell me he had passed away. I don't usually share my supernatural beliefs about death/dying with families, but I couldn't help but comment on the wind chimes later on, and his wife said, yeah, he collected wind chimes, that doesn't surprise me at all, and turns on the light on the back patio, showing me literally hundreds of chimes which had been silent all night until he passed. Not a worker in that field. But when my dad was in the hospital, I turned off the ringer on my phone and fell asleep. About 1 a.m., I heard the doorbell ring. I got up. No one was at the door. I walked around the house and saw absolutely nothing. I checked my phone and turned on the ringer. Almost immediately the hospital called to tell me my dad had died and would it be okay to harvest some of his organs for transplant. I used to be a nurse assistant on a cancer floor that also served as the hospice floor. The number of times a patient would pass and be removed from a room, only to have that room's call light continue to go off without anyone inside, was just nuts. And before you say maybe the light was just damaged or moved strangely in the process of removing the body, that's the only time it would happen. Broken call lights, in any other circumstance, just wouldn't come on at all. My roomie/best bud is a mortician, and I'm around the funeral home a fair amount myself and know the staff pretty well. I've spent the night there before. Nothing weird happens there. I have had some experiences I can't explain, so I was a little surprised none of the staff ever had an odd experience, especially since some of them do believe in ghosts and whatnot. But they told me, if ghosts were real, why in the world would they linger at a funeral home? It's just a transition space, like an airport. No one wants to just stay in the damn airport. Haunt the place you died, or the people you love, or the home you never want to leave, or however it works, if it works. Who would want to linger in a funeral home they have no attachment to, that their body only visited after they already were gone? Not me, but my mom's ex's story. My grandpa was the mortician for a small town in the late 60s. The morgue was attached to the house that my mom lived in. That's just how it was, and it didn't bother her. One day her boyfriend, Tom, came over to the house and no one was home. They had been dating for a while and he was comfortable going inside and waiting for my mom to come home. On the way into the house, Tom noticed that the door and windows into the morgue were open, so he checked it out, found it empty, closed everything and went into the house. A few minutes later he heard a loud slamming noise come from the morgue, so he ran to see what was wrong and found that the doors and windows had been thrown fully open again. He got out of there real quick. When he told my grandpa about what happened, my grandpa just calmly explained that they had picked up Mrs. that morning and the spirits were there welcoming her and visiting with her. Next time Tom should just leave the doors and windows open. It's kinda custom at the hospital here to open a window for the deceased soul to ascend when a patient dies. The doctor or nurse who is with the patient or finds the patient will open the window as soon as they are done tending to the patient. I don't know if I believe in that, but I still think the gesture is lovely, just a very small act for someone after they died. I used to work as a nursing assistant in assisted living communities. Usually when a resident started to need hospice they were transferred out to a higher level of care, so I didn't see death for a long time. When I first started, my favorite resident, let's call her Marilyn, would play Scrabble with me. She was completely alert and oriented. Sometimes she likes to sit quietly with an iPod shuffle clipped onto her vest and these huge headphones. She loved music. Slowly she started to decline. I would help her get ready for bed and she would get upset when she forgot how to do something. The only thing that calmed her down was playing music off my phone. She liked Frank Sinatra and the Beatles. Her independent ability declined rapidly and soon she was bedridden. Still, loved listening to music. This was during COVID, and her quality of life was diminishing so quickly that we didn't transfer her out. She had an apartment at the facility with all her belongings where she was comfortable. By the end her dementia had progressed to the point that she couldn't remember how to swallow. Marilyn passed away with me, the head nurse and her family at her bedside in her apartment, Unit 202. I did her post-mortem care afterwards, styled her hair how she liked to wear it, even clipped her little iPod onto her shirt. A few days after she died, a woman in 203, her neighbor, kept wandering into the lobby during night shift, always at 3 a.m. She complained of loud music coming from Unit 202. That apartment was vacant, just full of Marilyn's belongings. She said the music was so loud it was deafening. Whenever the night shift worker went to check, he didn't hear anything. Not really creepy, more sad. I miss Marilyn. When my cousin was 18 he was in a bad wreck and him, his girlfriend and her sister were all pronounced dead at the scene. The police arrived to inform my aunt, his mom, and she asked that he be sent to a specific funeral home. While they were preparing to embalm him he raised up and asked, "Where the hell am I?" The funeral director said it was the first time he ever had to go home and change pants. I should add that the top of his head was open and his brain was exposed. He was sent to the hospital. The same police officer came to my aunt's to tell her he was not dead but in the hospital. They thought he'd be in a vegetative state. But a few weeks later he walked out of the hospital. My aunt said it was the worst and best day of her life. I worked in ward nursing for 10 years. The spookiest thing that happened was a doctor hiding under the bed when I cleaned my first body and scaring the shit out of me. That definitely helped me get over the fear factor of working with the dead. Bodies groan and leak when you roll them to clean them, but that's normal. You just talk to them nicely as if they were alive, e.g. we're just going to put you in your nicest pajamas for your son to come and say goodbye. I'll give your face a clean. I'll paint your nails fresh as I know you like them this way. On most wards there was a haunted room that staff members would avoid. They all said it was haunted because the buzzer would mysteriously off by itself. Funnily enough, it would always stop buzzing randomly after maintenance came to fix it. Might be a little tangential, but bear with me. For many years, I was in the US Navy based in Japan. After the tsunami hit Fukushima, we spent a few months off the coast resupplying helicopters that were ferrying supplies and searching for bodies of people who were washed out to sea. When we did find a body, we were instructed to put them in a body bag and store those bags in an area called the Starboard Castleway, sheltered area outside of the pressurized interior, until a Japanese Coast Guard helicopter could come by to retrieve them. For a while after we were finished with that mission, some of my shipmates reportedly saw ghosts in that area of the ship. I didn't see any ghosts, but it was not uncommon for me to feel some unnatural chills there. I used to work in a nursing home. The residents in certain rooms would complain about a man in their room at night, but hallucinations are common in the elderly, so it wasn't really noticed. One night I was moping the dining room, which had huge windows overlooking the garden. It was around 1 a.m. so pitch black outside and low lighting inside. I had this horrible feeling of being watched, so looked up and reflected in the window was a man behind me. He had a brown suit in, a bowler hat and the cruelest look on his face. He grinned and his mouth was too big. This happened in seconds, and when I turned around there was obviously noon there, but I'll never forget that look of evil on his face. I paid more attention to the residents after that, and they'd all seen the same man. He just enjoyed terrorizing people. I have a million that are more grotesque and gory than this one, but it stands out to me. I was once working at a mortuary and had to go pick up a man from the medical examiner's office. When you do that, at least where I'm from, you get a receipt when they release the body to you. The receipt has all of the personal belongings that are with the deceased. When I brought the man back to the office, I opened up the body bag to make sure all the belongings were there and double-checking the receipt. When I opened up the bag, I was stunned to find this dude looked almost exactly like me. He was my age, had similar tattoos in similar spots, had the same long hair I do, even had the same style of jewelry I was wearing. It took me so off guard that I stood there in an existential crisis until the embalmer came in and was like, "Hey Spartan M00, how's it going? Holy shit, that guy looks like you." It's the only case I've had nightmares about. I'll be the one in the body bag with the deceased man opening me up. Mom told me stories when I was growing up. Her first job out of nursing school was an RN in the ER of an old hospital in Virginia in the mid-1980s. There was the man in the hat and patient one. Most of the nurses had stories about them. The man in the hat would show up and stand outside of rooms after visiting hours. The patients often died soon after. Patient one was a woman in a very old hospital gown. She'd walk in the halls before entering random rooms. Those patients usually coded. They took the man to be an omen of death and the woman to be a heads up to grab the crash card. Back when I worked in cardiology, we had this one single room at the ass end or the floor. We'd put palliative patients or patients that needed isolation in there. I swear 3 different patients in the years I worked there told me they had woken in the middle of the night and seen an old man and a little girl holding hands, both standing at the foot of the bed, doing nothing. Edit, wording. I worked within hospice and long-term care. The spookiest phenomenon was the man in the corner. It happens all the time for people actively dying. They see a shadowy man in the corner of their room. Not paranormal, but my wife grew up in a funeral home. Mom was a funeral director. They had a cat that would wander into viewings and the relatives would always comment that it was grandma or whoever visiting in cat form. Obligatory, haven't worked around death/burial, but, as a part of my culture, we frequently visit the graveyard to pay respects to our deceased. My brother passed away when he was 8 months old from leukemia. He was born with it and eventually he was buried next to my grandmother who passed away over a decade later. My uncle would frequently visit her grave, but he also left little toy cars on my brother's grave, and once there was a new burial a few plots down and the family was holding their overnight vigils for their family member. When he stopped by our family plot, he was approached by a member of the other family. Apparently late at night they would see glimpses of a young boy playing around our family plot, but no one could approach him. My uncle looked over at my brother's grave and noticed that the toy cars were missing. Not a ghost story, but a story around a morgue. When I was in first year of medical school, one anatomy lab tech killed a colleague, then embalmed the body. While on the escape from the police, he set fire to a bunch of churches for unclear reasons over the span of about a week. They found his car but he vanished. They found his body a year later in a well-known Toronto park. https://www.cbc.ca/news/canada/toronto-police-news/canada/link-1.1609171 https://www.cbc.ca/news/canada/decomposing-body-helps-solve-a-1.1888944. I am an ICU RN. We had a septic patient in the unit. She was 29 weeks pregnant. She went into labor on my shift and we delivered her baby, stillborn. I did post-mortem care on the baby, retrieved the proper transport container and walked the baby down to the morgue. It was the middle of the night, I'm in an elevator alone. I hear a baby start wailing. I absolutely lose my shit and rip open the cover, and just as I go to zip down the bag, I hear a calming male voice say, "Hush little one, I've got you, no need to cry." The crying stopped immediately. Shaking, I opened the bag and saw exactly what I expected to see, a deceased 29-week-only baby. I am a big bearded 40-year-old ICU nurse and that was the scariest shit I've ever experienced. No one believes me to this day. I don't even want to speculate what the crying or the voice was. God. Even typing that out I felt my chest tightening. I work in long-term enhanced care, People don't get better but we keep them comfortable. A couple stories I can think of. One, a husband and wife both with severe, almost nonverbal dementia in the same room but different beds. I have my back to the husband as I'm turning the wife who is facing him. Suddenly her eyes get wide and she looks terrified. She says, "He doesn't look very good with his face blue like that." I'm like, oh shit, did he die? But when I turned around he was alive and sleeping. I don't know what that woman saw. 2, a tall shadow man on one specific unit. Multiple people have seen it, some even following it into rooms thinking it's a patient, but then no one's there. 3, there was a man who had a cardiac event while sitting on the toilet. He fell forward and put a hole in the bathroom wall. He died. Soon after, a new woman moves into the room after everything is fixed. She comes out to the nurse's station one night pissed off. She says, "Who's going to tell that man to get out of my room? And when are they fixing the giant hole in the bathroom?" 4, a very nice family was sitting with the resident while he died. The man had been basically comatose for 2 days already. The sister comes out and asks for a Bible. This was not a religious family. She said he had sat straight up, eyes bugged out and started screaming, then flopped back down. I was like, say no more, and found her a Bible. While I was in nursing school, I worked as a night shift tech on a general hospital floor. Our sister floor became the COVID floor during the pandemic. One night we got a call from upstairs that a patient had passed away and they were out of body bags, so a nurse and I went upstairs to bring them one. On our way back to our floor, the elevator doors closed like normal but the elevator didn't go anywhere. All of a sudden the doors opened back up and then closed again, and we were moving. We looked at each other and the nurse said out loud, "It's okay, we'll show you the way out." Hospital windows don't open like the old days, so I guess souls have to take the elevator. Not really a ghost story, but on a night shift a few weeks ago, a patient pressed the call bell and was really upset that a man with a green t-shirt was in her room. I turned on the light and there was nobody there, so I reassured her and she fell back to sleep. The man in the room next door, who hadn't walked in years and was palliative, died around 2 hours later, and he just happened to be wearing a green t-shirt. Kind of made me picture him trying to find his way out. I have several stories from when I worked as a mortuary transport tech. The job was basically transporting the deceased from where they were to where they needed to go. Turns out dead people can have a lot of appointments. One time though I had an experience I've never forgotten. I was dropping someone off at the science donation place. This is when you donate your body to science and they take it from there. So I wheeled in the deceased, unlocked the freezer, and did all my stuff I had to do in there. I placed him on the board, got the lift out, and placed him on the shelf. The interesting thing about the freezer was that most everything, once it's processed, was wrapped in this blue tape type thing. And you could definitely tell what was inside. Legs, hands, feet, etc. Kind of interesting to me at the time. Anyway, I shut the freezer and locked it back up, and started wheeling the gurney back over to the garage door. The science drop-off and processing area was a big L shape, with the freezer off to the larger long portion, and then you turn the corner and there's desks and filing cabinets and whatnot. I about had a heart attack as I turned the corner and there is just this guy standing there examining files in the file cabinet. Looked just like you or me. Dressed modernly, but out of place for what people normally wear back there. I stopped and said that he'd have to forgive me, but he almost gave me a heart attack. It didn't look like he heard me at all, or even knew I was there. I should mention this was also about 1 a.m., and I'd never seen anyone at the place this late. So I said, "Well, sorry if I startled you or anything," and went on about my finishing up stuff. Got the gurney back in the van, closed and locked the large garage door from the inside, all the while this guy is just standing there, staring at an open file in front of him, not paying any attention to me. I had to use the bathroom, so I told him that's where I'd be going and I'd be right back. Again, no response. I thought maybe he's deaf and couldn't hear me. So I went to the bathroom, and came back to the garage and the guy is gone but the file cabinet is still open. I didn't know where he went, and I hadn't heard anyone walk down the hallway past the bathroom. I checked and made sure everything I was responsible for was still locked, and it was. So I just announced that I was going to be leaving and locking up to set the alarm. No response. And that's what I did, and left. I'm not sure who he was, or is, or what happened. But it was definitely an odd experience and one I still remember perfectly. I have a few other memories about my time at the job, if anyone else wants to hear. Nothing like what happened above though. Not a ghost story, but I'm an archaeologist and spent some time conducting a survey of an island in the Pacific, where a horrific battle took place in 1944. Working in the jungle, you are surrounded by noise throughout the day. Then, on one of the last days of the survey, we reached the spot, an area surrounded by a ring of large rocks, where the Japanese garrison's commander and staff had committed suicide as organized resistance crumbled and US troops closed in, after months of fighting resulting in thousands of deaths. Anyway, we were busy recording the site, and I was focused on the work because there was a lot of unexploded ordnance, bombs, landmines, grenades, you name it, to watch out for. Then, eventually, my colleague called out to me softly, "Hey, you hear that?" I looked up and asked what he meant. He said, "Dude, just listen," and we realized that the whole time we had been on the site we had not heard a single noise, no bird calls, no insects chirping. You could hear a pin drop. The moment we walked out from the rocks, we were once again hit by the everyday sounds of jungle life. I don't necessarily believe in ghosts, but that place really did make us all uncomfortable. I'll never forget that oppressive atmosphere. Roommate back in college was an intern at a coroner's office. Told me about a heavy-set guy that had been brought in that would pass gas, loudly, every time they moved it. Took the body a couple of days to run out of gas. Don't know if that's normal, but it creeped him out and I found it to be interesting to hear about. I don't have any ghost stories, but when I worked at a funeral home, a gravedigger I would talk to when I was off to the side during graveside services had a good story about a guy who used to visit his wife's grave frequently to feed birds around it so they'd gather there and keep her company. He, presumably, thought this was a sweet thing to do, but the cemetery staff were always having to wash bird shit off her headstone. When I was a kid I had a great uncle who was the caretaker for a local cemetery. Sometimes my dad would go work with him just to make some extra dough. One time, my pops was unavailable so he gave the job to me. Had to bury a guy. Nothing ghostly happened. It is a strange dichotomy though. On one hand here's a family on one of the worst days of their lives, and on the other there's me and old Uncle Pete waiting to fill the grave. It had rained all that week. Graves fill up with a lot of water when that happens. As the lift was lowering the vault, in case peeps don't know, a burial requires the coffin to be sealed in a huge concrete vault, into the grave. My uncle looked at me and said, "Shit, I hope he's got his swimming trunks on." And that was the day that I learned you can inject humor in a dark situation. For about a year I delivered in-home medical equipment to hospice patients. Saw some people in really bad shape. The kinda shape where if it were me I'd be saying, "Y'all need to end me, show me some goddamn mercy here." I also learned that cancer has a very distinct aroma. The stronger the aroma the sooner that person would be passing on. I'd be in the middle of a hospital bed set up with an oxygen concentrator and everything else and I'd be like, "Me or one of the other guys will be back here tomorrow or the day after." And usually that's what would happen. There was a time I pulled up to a residence just to deliver some backup oxygen tanks. A guy probably in his 40s meets me in the driveway and says he's not sure if they're gonna need it. Then he hears his name called from inside followed by, "He's gone, he's gone." Dude went back inside and I just said, "Call your nurse right away," and I got in my truck and left. The denial some people fall into is tough sometimes. We would have families that'd be like, "Can you park your truck really far away so nobody in the neighborhood knows we have hospice in here?" Sorry, it's a shitty time, but no, I sure can't do that. The worst were the children cases. Ugh. I remember one kid, he was maybe 11? His room was just plastered with photos, all him with nearly every player on the local NFL team. He had been gifted so many things from that team his room looked like a storefront. I set up his equipment on a Tuesday and an aide was telling me, obviously they know it's terminal but they're just looking forward to getting him out of the hospital so he can at least be at home for his last few months. I was back by Friday clearing everything out because the little fella was home a grand total of like 36 hours before he left. Fucking dagger in the heart. His mother was a complete disaster, walking around the house clutching his framed school photo she had taken off the wall. No ghostly stuff, though. No weird occurrences, no weird noises or anything. Also worked in a hospital when I was younger and would mop and buff the floors in the morgue. The orderlies told me they used to prank new guys by having one of them lay on the table and then jump up at them. Thankfully they never did that to me, haha. Wow, I just rambled way too long. Sorry everybody. Ain't nobody give a good goddamn about yo stories, foo. And now you talking to yourself, people gonna think ya nuts? I had a buddy who worked in forensics and shit, figuring out how people died. He had a body come in from the city, and the corpse was covered in scratch marks. Like deep, horrid scratches as well as bite marks around the collarbone. It obviously came from an animal, but they couldn't figure out what it was. The more wild thing is that the guy died in an apartment in the middle of a city. I work in a cardiac ICU, we have quite a lot of death around here. That being said, we had one patient that comes to mind. I'll call him Greg G, fake name. Greg was on the unit for months. He fought very hard to stay alive every day, and to his credit he was getting better for a good space of time. Greg was fairly old. Late 70s or early 80s. The thing is, he, initially, looked very young, and acted very hip. He became a meme around the unit and everyone loved him because he was an old white dude who loved rap, Tupac and Biggie, and would throw gang signs sarcastically as a nonverbal K that he was feeling okay. He had a trach and so he couldn't talk. He also had his family bring mood lights into his room that synced with his music. I kid you not, his room was playing rap in rave mode sometimes. We called him DJ Greggy G and he loved it. Unfortunately, he took a turn for the worse. His condition deteriorated rapidly and ultimately he died. We were devastated as a unit. His family let us keep his mood lights and to this day we keep them plugged in at the nurse's station. However, one day the mood lights turned off. We were saddened. Nobody could get them working. But then, they turned on. We were happy. And then they started flashing super irrationally. Then we heard the patient that was in Greg's old room start screaming. We went in to check on her. She was a confused old lady who would say some pretty wild things, but this one was weird. She said that she was watching the flashing lights in the hall, she could see them from her room to be fair, then she said that she saw a silhouette of a man cast into the wall from the lights. Then, she started spasticity yelling tell Greg to leave. It's not his room anymore. Tell Greg to go. There is no way she knew it was Greg's room. And with her memory being the way it was, there is also no way she would remember even if she did get told. Kinda spooky. Perhaps I'm too late for this, but figured I'd share the story anyway. So my aunt married a man from a relatively well-off English family, who had purchased part of a large mansion house near Miller, Cornwall, rural coastal area in the south of England. As a result, when I was younger we were occasionally invited down to spend a few nights there in the summer. It's a pretty idealistic location, with the house built on the side of a hill facing directly to the sea. As I'll explain, the house used to be a guest house, and has always been described as haunted by members of the local community. At the time of my experience, however, I didn't know the real reason why it was considered haunted and I only found that out later. During renovations, for example, the builders had claimed to have seen the ghost of a woman in an old-fashioned dress walking down the stairs. Nevertheless, I'd never experienced anything until this happened. One summer, I brought my now ex-girlfriend to the house with me, and we stayed in a bedroom on the ground floor. It wasn't an ensuite, so to go to the loo you would have to leave the room and walk across the hallway to the toilet across the way. In the middle of the night, my GF at the time wakes me to say that she's going to the loo and she'll be back in a moment. I sit up groggy-eyed in the darkness, say okay and then lie down to go back to bed. She doesn't turn the lights on, but in the darkness I can make out her opening the door, leaving the room and closing the door behind her. I lie down, close my eyes and about a minute later hear the door open again, and someone walk into the room. Assuming it to be my girlfriend, I don't open my eyes, but shift to make room for her to get into bed. I hear her walk over to the bed and get in, and I reach over to embrace her, and feel what feels like the body of a woman. My eyes are still shut at this point. Suddenly I hear a woman's voice from across from me, not my GFS, asking me, "Are you going to come tomorrow?" Realizing it's not my GF, I open my eyes in shock, and at that very moment my girlfriend opens the door to the room. I look across and realize there is no one in bed with me at all. I bolt up and my GF has to spend the next hour calming me down while I explain what happened. The next day I tell my uncle about this and ask about why the house is considered is haunted. He laughs, saying I probably encountered a ghost of the people who used to stay in the guest house. I ask for an explanation and he says that during the 1900s there was a terrible boating accident in this part of Cornwall and a boat, the MV Darlwine, totally disappeared with something like 30-odd passengers. A large number of the, presumably dead, passengers were staying at the guest house. Hence why locals all presume the place to be haunted. Having heard this, I could only explain it as the ghost of one of the passengers, who was presumably asking me whether I was gonna come on their ill-fated boat trip the next day. Safe to say I avoided boats for the rest of that trip. I was an RN and was working in a very well-off town in MS. The hospital had 2 ICUs, with the second one being an overflow type unit on the 3rd floor. There were 7 rooms in that unit and room 2 was haunted. Numerous times different nurses watched something walk into the room, but the room would be empty without a patient in it. One time a nurse had an actual patient in room 2. It was about 4 a.m. and the nurse was going to do a dressing change. She took the stuff into the room and the patient asked what she was going to do. She said, "Change your dressings." The patient said, "Oh no, that other nurse was just in here about 30 minutes ago and did it." The nurse looked and yes, the dressing was fresh. She went out to the desk and told the one other nurse, "Thanks for doing that." The nurse was baffled and said, "I didn't change the dressing." They both freaked out a bit. Rumor has it that an RN that had worked for the hospital a long time died in that room. The hospital is now a dorm for a big college, so fun times may be had by a bunch of college students. EOL Dula here. Best ghost story is actually not really, but kinda is. So many of my clients have had loved ones who already have passed come to walk them through the veil. It's really neat and reassuring when a dying client greets their loved one. I had one lady insist, she had been bedbound for weeks, that she was going shopping with her sister in a couple days. So much that she was agitated until we got her purse and shoes ready for her when her sister arrived. The last morning she was verbal. She woke up and said to the empty doorway, "Oh, sister is here. I told you we were going." Her sister had been gone for years. She passed away that evening. It happens more often than it doesn't, and is such a source of comfort for me.